Even though Middle-earth Shadows of Mordor brandishes Tolkien's in-depth universe in its title, like a geeky child confessing their love via a t-shirt, Monolith Productions doesn't really do much in the way of epic storytelling, but that isn't entirely a bad thing, as it allows Shadows of Mordor to focus in on its stronger points of gameplay, in its rather unique form of story generation, and the enticing idea of being a ghostly, badass seeker of vengeance. Kind of like Ghost Rider, except there's no Nick Cage here to ham it up. The core of Shadows of Mordor comes down to three main elements: the Nemesis system, the combat, and Talion's Wraith powers. The combat is easy to grasp, acting as a simple entry point like most modern AAA games. The combat mechanics are reminiscent of a baby conceived between Warner Bros. Arkham Knight series and Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed series. As such, you'll essentially become a bouncy ball, ricocheting between enemies until you build up enough momentum to pop the head off of one, while occasionally having to respond to a button prompt. Thankfully, the combat is fairly satisfying as each strike carries weight, especially the executions, which trigger a brutal animation. And to the game's credit, the formula is occasionally mixed up with different types of enemies, some requiring you to get behind or stun them, and a few that step back from the pack, peppering Talion with arrows and spears. The combat system is often broken up with moments of archery and wraith abilities, or completely subverted using stealth, although stealth really just comes down to pressing a button to kill an enemy, or pressing a different button to kill said enemy even more, which sends most of his allies running away in pure fear, screaming and wetting themselves. The largest part of the game, however, is the Nemesis system, a procedurally generated mechanic within the game that creates stories, enemies, and grudges unique to each player. The system is rather complex, but easy enough to explain. Notable orcs within the game are referred to as captains, and are led by 4 war chiefs. All of these orcs have different strengths and vulnerabilities, which affect their abilities in combat, and directly impacts their difficulty. For example, a captain may be immune to range attacks, but can be instantly defeated using a stealth takedown. Some captains are extra dangerous with special attacks and abilities. On top of this, captains wield different weapons: crossbows, shields, polearms, axes, etc. The uniqueness of this system is that all these variables are generated from a random pool, sometimes creating a miniature god to death, while also occasionally pumping out orcs as useless as a Saturday morning cartoon villain. The intention of the system is to make the orc armies feel like a living society, which it succeeds in doing. Orcs can level up, losing their vulnerabilities and gaining more strengths, which can take place without the player's direct intervention. Orcs will often partake in infighting as they attempt to reach for more power and gain notoriety. They can also evolve by killing Talion, which can even lead to a generic foot soldier gaining standing and becoming a captain. The Nemesis system is a great form of storytelling, capable of forging grand stories from the struggles, triumphs, and failures of each player. The great thing about this is that due to the sheer amount of orcs you will encounter, each player is essentially destined to come across their own personal Khan. Bolg! The motif tying the mechanics and story of the game together is Talion's Wraith abilities, which allows him to see enemies through walls, leap great distances, shoot ghost-like arrows, and control ghostly flames. But perhaps most importantly, Talion also gains the ability to see into and control the minds of orcs, which allows him to directly influence the growth of power within orc society. This all leads to an impressive moment of gameplay when the player comes face to face with a war chief. Tension rises as the war chief approaches, as the surrounding orcs howl and chant their war chief's name. Soon after, the player is thrust into an epic battle between the war chief and his subordinates, which can get out of hand quite quickly. By now, you'll have noticed that I'm not talking much about the story of the game, which is simply because the story is unfortunately rather generic and predictable, playing out in a linear Talion must now go here to kill this guy fashion, while not offering much in the way of standout characters, aside from the traitorous orc ratbag and perhaps the wounded dwarf hunter Torvin. The characters are well voice acted, but for the most part fall into the trappings of being written to fit a particular purpose, which leaves them feeling more like a waypoint or objective to get to the next part of gameplay, rather than an actual person. The same can be said for the overall story of the game, as outside of the initial amazing opening sequence, never really goes anywhere great, leaving most players progressing through the story only to gain abilities that are locked behind story-specific missions, which perhaps was done on purpose so that gamers would actually play the campaign, instead of running off into the wilds of Mordor slaying orcs with reckless glee like some kind of glorified psychopath. Shadows of Mordor could have been a lot better. But that doesn't mean that it's a bad game. It manages to be fun and unique amidst the trend of annual iterations. In the end, if you're looking for something different, or feel like being an unstoppable ghostly action hero, then this is a game you shouldn't soon overlook. Middle-earth Shadows of Mordor receives our recommendation of play it, as even if you don't finish the actual story, you'll come away with your own. And have a ton of fun slaying orcs for hours on end.